afflicted, I went astray, but now I have kept thy word. Thou art good and doest good. Teach me thy statutes. The proud have forged a lie against me, but I will keep thy precepts with my whole heart. Their heart is as fat as grease, but I delight in thy law. It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. The law of thy mouth is better to me than thousands of gold and silver.
Good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. My name is Paul Strangini. So we were in the last portion of 1 Corinthians 7, a lengthy chapter dealing with marriage and non-marriage, actually, because right now the question is still, what about the unmarried? And specifically, he talks about virgins, because there was a lot more of that going around at that time. It was important to preserve in society, to preserve yourself before marriage. Not being a virgin made a lot of women undesirable. At least that was the way things were. And there's a lot. There are reasons that can be so, like practical reasons, divorce, question about any pregnancy that might follow, especially if it was concealed. And for an older woman, maybe who had been married and been a widow, that would not be an issue. But for someone who was young, virginity was important going into the marriage, because it was also probably seen as a potential questions of self-control, questions of potential for adultery. And when when a man marries a woman, he invests a lot in her children, and knowing that they are your children is quite important to men. Unless, like I said, anything that you enter into with your eyes open is one thing. It's one thing if you enter into a relationship knowing you're going to be a stepfather. It's another thing to enter into a relationship and thinking the children are all going to be yours, or thinking that you're entering it with someone who has been keeping themselves. So, now this was let's read verse 36. But if any man think he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not, let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth stedfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. I almost wonder if in this context there's a sort of a sense of virgin means virginity. But he was saying, hey, in the previous chapter that, because of the current distress, it might be a good idea to not marry. Because in distressed times, there's all kinds of obvious reasons why. He says, I'm not going to burden you with the details of this, but it's true. And because he doesn't want to burden them with the details of the trouble you can have in troublous times being married, because he doesn't want that to be a reason that dissuades people from getting married. Like, he doesn't want all the fear and all that to be a factor, I think. And when he says in verse 36, in verse 35 he says, I'm not trying to cast a snare upon you. I'm not trying to make it so that, you're afraid to get married, because he talks about how that the unmarried may serve God at their pleasure, whereas the married have to contend with a spouse. I said, in my opinion, also, that's theoretically true, but not necessarily practically true. A man who's so distracted by his sexual desire may find that he doesn't serve God very well without a wife. And that a wife can be, especially specifically, a Christian wife can help a man serve God even better. Paul himself says, "Who knows, O wife, if you will not save your husband?" If a wife has the potential to bring salvation to her husband, then her presence in his life is not going to be anything negative. And remember, Paul said all that by permission. I don't totally agree with him, because I think some of the things he says, he says by permission, and also they're from his experience as a single person, and things he thinks that might burden him having a wife. But because he is so dedicated to Christ, and as he describes it in verse 37, able to stand steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, and have power over his own will. If you have power over your own will and all that, and you keep your virgin, and that's a power over your own will, I don't think that's like, it's your will. I'm a little bit, I almost feel like I should consult another translation on that. But I mean, I get the general gist of it. I'm not going to go to another translation. It also means that, back then a father had a great deal of say over when and how his daughter would marry. And what he's saying is, in verse 36, he's saying, if you think you're being, he's saying, in the previous he used the word comely, which means orderly, or that which is acceptable. The word actually comes from moneo, which means like able to abide. But he says he wants things to be suitable, and that we could attend on the Lord without distraction. But if you think you're acting in an unsuitable manner towards your virgin, if she passed the flower of her age, and needs so require, if you feel that it is necessary to marry them off, let him do what he will, he sinneth not. Meaning, if a father feels like he needs to stop, he wants to keep this condition for some time going beyond a certain point, but then it becomes obvious that it's not a good thing, he's not sinning in letting them marry. I don't think Paul ever gave a commandment not to. In fact, a lot later on he talks about those who, not in this book, but in other books, when he talks about men who bring false doctrine into the church, one of the things he talks about is forbidding to marry. And I think that this whole chapter has to do with the fact that some people were, as I said last week, there was an impulse early on in the church to say that, well, the Lord could come back soon, and so we should all exercise self-control to the utmost, and perhaps not even get married, but serve God only. And Paul is assuring people that it's no, and you can imagine how that could be taken to an extreme, especially with social pressure. It starts to become where people start to think, when there's too much social pressure to conform to a certain kind of behavior, people begin to think of violating that social norm as a sin. And Paul wanted to make it clear that marriage is not a sin. And you think about that in contrast to the attitudes of today, where everybody wants to get married, or at least theoretically wants to get married. We have a very different issues. But then the issue was, should we allow people to get married anymore? Or that was moving in that direction, and Paul wanted to put a stop to it. But it's also affirming the benefits of being celibate. Having no necessity. And I think he refers to lust and such. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well. You do well to give your daughter in marriage. Let her marry. But he that giveth her not doeth better. That it was still all by permission, and only because he was thinking of service. And I do think that for a man, it is more likely that being married is going to be less of a distraction. It is a distraction, no doubt. Like I said, he can be so distracted by his desire that it actually is more practical to get married to a Christian woman than to not be married at all. That was certainly, I'm speaking from my own experience. I think it would not have went well for me if I had tried to stay unmarried. And so, for women, though, it may be different because when women are younger, they are less interested in sex than their male counterparts. That's just generally a biological fact. And so, therefore, the likelihood that being single is going to be a major distraction for them early on is not true. But when they get older, as Paul says, if she passed the flower of her age, and I think that means quite simply her biological clock is ticking. She's approaching 30 or maybe more. Probably approaching 30 is generally the thought of like passing, sort of like when you start getting up to 30 as a woman, it's like you only have so many childbearing years left at that point, like where it even makes sense to have children. So another 10 years left minimum, but 15 or 20 at a maximum. And, a lot of women are usually, or it is usually considered most desirable for women to bear children when they're younger. Your body is more suited to it. In fact, a lot of, I'm not going to get into the medical aspects of that. The female body actually, pregnancy and childbearing actually helps you to fully mature biologically. I'm not going to go into the details of that. So he that, Paul thinks it's better not to be married. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. And what he means by only in the Lord is, again, he's speaking to Christians. A lot of times people forget the context of the Bible. They treat the Bible as if it's just talking to random people. Like when it says in 2 Peter, God is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish. They assume that letter is written to humanity, when it's not. And that passage isn't directed at humanity. There are passages which are directed at humanity. But, they have to be, everything has to be taken in the context in which it was intended. And again, this time it's obvious. He's not speaking to the world at large, but to Christians. If her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. So again, marriage is till death do us part. Again, we haven't talked about this, but marriage is, divorce is not acceptable. And if you divorce and remarry according to the Lord Jesus, that is adultery. But if her husband be dead, she is loosed by the law. Meaning the law that bound her to her husband is now of no effect because he is dead. And the law has no more jurisdiction over him or over their union together. And so she is at liberty to marry another man if she will, but within the confines of the Christian faith is what he's saying. Obviously. But she is happier if she abide after my judgment. And I think also I have the Spirit of God. I think I speak in the Spirit of God that if she's a widow, if a woman has already been married and had children, she is free to marry who she wills, but she is not by any means required to be married. And he's saying, if she is happier, but according to if she abides, I'm not sure if he means, this is the way I judge it. She's happier if she abide unmarried. Or he's saying she's happier if she abide according to the way I say she abide, which would be unmarried. I think also I have the Spirit of God. And he's saying, I think I speak that in the Spirit of God, that she'd be happier after being married. And I see his point there. When your spouse dies, especially depending on how long you've been. I mean, like if you're a young woman, I think he mentions this. He's saying, in fact, does he get in that? No, he doesn't here. But, he says that, I think this gets into 2 Corinthians, but like, above a certain age, he says, don't, because they will wax wanton against Christ. I mean, don't accept them into this. They started establishing orders which seemed almost like nuns and priests, where they would, they would abide unmarried, and he was saying younger widows do not. I mean, like let's say a girl's like 22 or 3 and her husband dies. She is most likely. It is most likely. It is. It's most likely that she will eventually want to be married again, and she's too young to then spend the rest of her life single. But if a woman's husband is, let's say she's in her 60s and he dies, that seems like she'd probably be happier not trying to start a new relationship. And that could be reasonable. Okay, so chapter 8, verse 1. Now as touching things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. And if any man think he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. That's a verse I love. But if any man love God, the same is known of him. As concerning, therefore, the eating, that was a bit of a parenthetical interjection. All right. First, I'm going to look at his groundwork verses, which are the first 3. Now he wants to touch on, meaning that's a metaphor, touching things offered to idols. Not literally touching things offered to idols, like, ooh, can we touch things that were offered to idols? But rather, I want to address that topic. And what are things offered to idols? Well, it has to do with, it's a complicated subject in the New Testament, because there are definitely scriptures which forbid it. Say, do not eat things sacrificed to idols. In fact, in Revelation, it talks about, because you suffer that woman Jezebel, who calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. So eating things sacrificed to idols is at times explicitly forbidden. Now, what Paul's about to do, if you were to misconstrue what he's doing, you could say, he's teaching them to eat things sacrificed to idols, but that's not what he's doing. He is responding to a letter which we don't have. But from the later context, it makes it clear, and we will touch on that. It makes it clear that when Paul talks about eating things sacrificed to idols, he refers to meats that were offered to idols through the temple systems of the pagans, like the Romans and the Greeks, of course. They worshiped many gods, and they had meats offered to the temple. Well, oftentimes there was more meat offered at the temple than the priests of the temple could consume within the time before such meat would spoil. So instead of eating the meat themselves, they would sell it off to butchers to sell to the public, and they would take the money and then use that for what they needed in the temple. So there was often at butcher shops, as it's called, the shambles, and later things, like your discount butcher, you go down to a discount butcher in the Greek and Roman times, and you would buy meat. And the concern was, what if some of that meat was something that was sacrificed to idols. And you unwittingly ate it. And that's the question. The question is not of literally partaking of things offered to idols knowingly, meaning sitting down in the idol's temple and eating, in the idolatrous manner, the way, that's a drinking blood and eating things sacrificed to idols. In Acts, that was the things that they forbid. But Paul is going to give us a little understanding here of our liberty. And he starts off saying this, that we know that we have knowledge. That knowledge is a very powerful, dangerous, and potentially pride-inducing thing. We know things, or we think we do, right? We think, like it says, if any man think he knows anything, you think you know something? Well, let me tell you, you know nothing the way you ought to know it. As Paul says in other places, we see through a glass darkly. A lot of what we think we know is peripheral knowledge. It is not the depth of the knowledge of a thing. In fact, there's so much, even when I think of like science and the world and their ideas of what they know are scientific facts. Just consider that, 40 years ago, they had that same arrogance of they know, we have all this knowledge. And you look at the scientific things of where they thought they were full up with knowledge they had 40 years ago. I'm thinking more like 50 or 60 years ago. Even 40 years ago, though, seriously. 40 years ago, well, not 40, a little more than that, like let's say a little less than 45. My great-grandfather died of a bad blood transfusion in the hospital. That's in the 70s, and you almost feel like that's the modern era, and at the time they certainly did. But they still had many things they didn't understand properly, and mistakes were made, and it was much more primitive than it is now. And yet, do we know everything now? Do we not still make mistakes? We do. And there are degrees to which we are ignorant and we don't know. Every time people talk about stuff, like they talk about subatomic particles and atoms and quarks and all the little things flying around. And they've discovered stuff and they've put names on it and say, oh, it's a quark, or oh, it's a subatomic particle. It's smaller than this other thing that we gave a name to. It's a smaller piece of it. We have no idea what these things really are yet. We really don't. We don't know what the real fundamental nature of hardly anything is. And we sure as heck don't understand. All right. And then when you come down to religion, you got to have the utmost kind of humility. You're talking about God here. And when we talk about God, we got to understand that, like, we think we know him, we try to know him, we seek him out, we believe we have the Spirit which searches all things. But even having the Spirit, we got to understand that, like, we are not the Spirit. The Spirit, like, our thoughts are not his thoughts. And though he shares things with us and he teaches us things, we got to maintain a sense of humility and understanding just how little we really know. Like, what we know about God is stuff we think we know. And it's things we believe. But most of it is like, how do we really know? We don't really know. And so, Paul talks about here knowledge puffing up. Or in the English we would say it inflates. And we talk about people having inflated egos. or inflated sense of self-worth. The idea of inflation means that something is being blown up from within and is becoming larger, like you inflate a balloon. An inflated balloon looks bigger than an uninflated balloon. But the inflated balloon is nothing more than the uninflated balloon, except now it's got a lot of air in it. It's got a lot of empty space, and we know the space is filled with molecules of air. But air is not a very substantial thing. It can blow like the wind, but it is, one of the quintessential, if you want to refer to something that's insubstantial, but still has substance, when we want to talk about something truly insubstantial, you can say, the vacuum of space. But we're not talking about the vacuum of space, we're talking about the ethereal nature of the air. The air is not substantive. You can't eat air. From what I heard that there are people, you've heard of vegetarians? Well, there's the breatharians, people who think they can survive just breathing. They don't need food. It's weird, I know, but apparently it exists. All right, so you can't, but air does not nourish. And a lot of knowledge is like air. It makes you feel smarter. It makes you look more intelligent if you can just trot out a bunch of facts. But it does not actually make you wiser or a better person. And I always say that the knowledge I crave most is the knowledge like how, when confronted with a situation that would cause me to lose control of my emotions in one way or another, whether for anger, fear, sorrow, how does one take control of that and restrain oneself, at least to the degree that you can be assured that you do not sin. And I say to be assured because because the point is not avoiding feelings, but avoiding sin. So to control my feelings to the degree that I sin not. Because sometimes my feelings, my emotions will lead me to sin. But that's a powerful kind of knowledge. A powerful knowledge that you can rein in your feelings, that you can rein in your emotions and take control of them. Or addictions, to have power over addictions. To be, there are times when I just feel so motivated to do things, where I just feel like this spark of creativity or, there's just a feeling of I really want to work on something and I dive into it with all my might, with all my heart. And I wish I could just turn that on like a spigot. I wish I had that knowledge. But there's a lot of other knowledge in the world besides powerful knowledge that enables you to do things, enables you to accomplish things, enables you to be something more than you were. That kind of knowledge is a very different kind of knowledge. This knowledge he speaks of is I know something. And in this case, it's going to be about idols. And he always confronts this contradiction between, well, not contradiction, but there's a conflict between those who know the law and those who know liberty. And on both sides, their knowing is in danger of puffing them up one against the other, causing those who know the law to judge those who take liberty, and those who take liberty to despise those who know law, or who think they know the law. Verse 3 seems almost just an interjection. If any man know God, the same is known of him. Any man love God. Though what I think he's saying there is quite simply, as he's interjecting, that, it's far more important that we be known of God, that God know us, that he know who we are, so to speak. Though God knows everybody, right? But there's a special sense in which, in the scriptures, it can be said that God knows you. Like Jesus, when he says in Matthew chapter 7, he says, many will say unto me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, and in your name have cast out devils, and in your name have done many wonderful works? And he says, but I will profess to them, I don't know you. I never knew you. Depart from me, that work iniquity. So what he means by that is that there is a sort of in-group preference that Jesus is referring to of he knows us more intimately. Yes, he knows the cattle on 1,000 hills. He knows the very hairs of your head. He knows the inner workings of every man, but there are certain people with whom he has more intimate relations. And part of having him know you is communicating to God, or even attempting to communicate with God. And the more frequently we attempt this communication, the more he feels like he knows us, because we direct our minds towards him. If we don't direct our minds towards God, he could legitimately feel like, well, you don't love me, and we are not familiar with each other. We don't know each other in any way, shape, or form. And and it is most essential that God know us, that he notice us. And if we love God, God will know us. He knows those that love him. Those that give heed to him, those that are interested in his things, are known of him. And that is important. That is a more important knowing than what we might know, what we think we know. So as concerning, therefore, eating of those things that are sacrificed, that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. See, we know this. We know there's no other God but one, and an idol is nothing. And he's warning ahead of time, be careful, this knowledge can cause you to be inflated. It can cause you to have a sense of superiority over people who might be more superstitious. We know there's no other God. So eating this meat sacrificed to idols is nothing. It's essentially the knowledge you could have. I can eat whatever I want. And certainly this meat that has been sacrificed to idol is nothing to me. I don't believe in the idols, and I don't believe in any other gods. For though there be that are called gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many and lords many, there's all kinds of stuff that's called God. There are all kinds of gods out there, lords out there, right? But unto us there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. There's only one God, the Father, and our Lord Jesus Christ. All right, there's one. Howbeit there is not in every man this knowledge. For some, with conscience of the idol, unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. So they eat the meat that is sacrificed to idol as something sacrificed to an idol. Meaning that now that it's been sacrificed to an idol, the meat itself has become especially associated with that idol, and there's almost a magical property to it. So they have a sort of superstitious belief in the meat which has been sacrificed to an idol. And I do think in this chapter, though it's all about things sacrificed to idols, there are general principles, such as, if any man thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing as he ought to know it. That is a general principle, worthy of remembering in all kinds of situations. We can remember we don't know as much as we think we know. We think we're... because that causes us to take certain liberties at times, which can be damaging to others. Okay? So be careful. So what he's saying is, even though we know that the meat sacrificed to an idol has nothing actually special about it, in and of itself, it has no magical properties. There's no God that has put his power into it. There's nothing. But not everyone knows this or believes it, let's say. And with conscience of the idol, meaning they're conscious of the idol, or they have conscience that the idol is a thing, a god, or a devil, or anything, whatever, however they reckon it. And he's not necessarily speaking of believers. I think he might be speaking of just, there's people in the world who still honor these gods. And they eat these things in honor to these gods. And so their conscience is defiled because they believe in the idols. And when someone believes in a thing, and they do it, it defiles their mind because they think they're doing something that is actually wrong. And I like this, but meat commendeth us not to God. I've used this in another context. What did I say? Knowledge does not commend us to God, because to me, that's ultimately what he's saying. It's not the meat, it's our knowledge about the meat. For neither if we eat are we better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. See, there's always an impulse in someone who's, when you have knowledge, you think, well, I can prove my faith doing this thing. I can eat meat sacrificed to idols, and there, I've shown I have great faith. I don't believe in idols. I don't fear this thing. I haven't done anything wrong, and so through my liberty which I have in Christ to eat meat, because he's going to talk about, because like I said, the issue is actually not that they're going into a temple, although he does mention sitting at meat in the idol's temple. Yeah, but that's hypothetical. That is hypothetical. I do think that he's primarily speaking of inadvertently. People who worry about doing it inadvertently. So they won't go to certain places and buy meat because it might be. The reason I say inadvertently, because elsewhere we are told not to. I certainly think that going to an idol's temple and sitting down and eating the idol's meat is going too far. Though the idol is nothing, it doesn't actually harm you. If I was starving, I wouldn't ask questions. I would eat wherever I could. You know what I mean? And so what I'm saying about this is that my knowledge about this fact that this idol is nothing, it doesn't impress God that I know this. It's more impressive to God that I love my brother. You know what I mean? I think I know that this is so cool, I can do this. But maybe it's just better if I don't. You know what I mean? Not everything. It's there's a difference between being able to do something and it being something you ought to do. You know what I mean? I can do something without harm to me, but that doesn't mean that I should do it. Just because something, not everything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And they say whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I know they mean specifically things like, hard work. Yes, hard work is good. And it won't kill you, it'll make you stronger. But eating the meat of an idol is not going to make you stronger. You already know it's nothing. You don't have to prove it by going and eating it unless you're just being dishonest. I mean, I suppose, not that you have to, but if you're being dishonest, look at it, I can prove it. I'm not afraid to eat the meat of an idol. you're not really proving anything. Because if you're lying, you're just lying to yourself. And nobody cares what you think you know. Whether you're afraid to eat the idol's meat or not, if you don't have to eat it, why would you? You know what I mean? If it's not necessary, like I said, if you find yourself starving and someone offers you meat, as he says elsewhere, don't ask questions, just eat it. What I'm telling you, when he says meat commendeth us not to God, he's drawing what he means is what he talks about before, we have knowledge. And what you think you know does not impress God. I mean, and by thinking that I'm going to show off my liberty to God, God is not impressed with your liberty. Like, God, I never eat bacon thinking, look, God, I know I can eat this. He's not impressed. You know what I mean? I never, don't go to church on Sunday because I believe that every day, I honor every day alike, and think that impresses God. It does not commend me to God. It does not recommend me to God. Like, wow, look at his great faith. No. It's just knowledge. And being puffed up by it is foolishness. I do not, when you think you know stuff, don't think that God is impressed. He knows everything. He reveals everything. If he reveals something to you, don't then take that and then make a fool of yourself with it. Thinking like, I'm impressing God with what I know. He gave you what you know. He made you to know it. So if we eat, we are not the better. We are not showing ourselves better by doing something we have liberty to do. I'm not better by eating pork. I'm not like more, oh, wow, look at his faith. Or, oh, wow, he's got a lot of faith. He didn't go to church on Sunday or Saturday, depending on which, so the people who go on Saturday really don't believe in Sunday. Neither if we eat not are we the worse. If we avoid it, it doesn't make us worse. Just like, no, I don't mess with that stuff. It doesn't make you worse in the faith. As far as if you eat not. Now, if I take that knowledge of I think I know it's bad and we shouldn't eat it, and I start judging everybody, and I start becoming a legalist, then I am the worst. It's not because I don't eat, but it's because of the way I am towards my brethren. And that is the primary message of this, ultimately. We'll get to it. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. And you think you know things and you're acting a certain way, but you have no consideration of how it might affect other people. And that's something you ought to be much more thoughtful about. It'd be better to have knowledge of how your actions affect other people, especially people who are weak. This liberty of yours. And you can tell that there's a little bit of criticism dripping from that. Because this is against those who think they have knowledge. And in this chapter, it is those who believe in liberty. Those who believe in Christian liberty, who understand Christian liberty, which is something you get through knowledge. You understand that the law is done away in Christ. So a lot of things are permissible to us which were not permissible before. But as he says, all things are permissible, but not all things are expedient. And so you got to be careful as far as you can, there's a sense in which, we even know this, that a man can kill another man and be guiltless. This is something that happens. Situations, it all depends on the circumstances, right? But that liberty can understanding that can totally lead you into a position where you're getting tried for murder. Because you thought you knew that it was okay if it was under these circumstances. But people don't always, listen, and the circumstances aren't always clear. There's a lot of reasons why things can go astray. And men who abuse and use their liberty, trying to get away with things, end up caught often, if not always. For if any man see thee, which hast knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple. Now, I think that's purely hypothetical. I'm not saying, I don't think he's advocating doing that. He's going to the extreme. He's not advocating, because I think they were obtaining meat from butcher shops called the shambles. In fact, he mentions that. We'll get to it. If any man see thee which has knowledge, you have knowledge, you're full of all kinds of knowing things, sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? Now, meaning, you're emboldening him to do something that is against his conscience. Something that he still believes in the idols. But he thinks, well, maybe I'll do that. And I'll put this as an example a little differently. We don't have a lot of idol temples, right? But this is a principle that applies generally to things that are forbidden. But that we have some sort of liberty. Like I've often used examples like tobacco or moderate alcohol use. Some people use alcohol moderately. You know, and you got to be careful because, like, let's say you use alcohol moderately. Let's say you only drink it on the holidays. You know, I just have a couple glasses of wine on Christmas or on Easter and Thanksgiving, and I have a hard lemonade on the 4th of July. All right, let's say those are your 4 drinking holidays of the year, and that's all you drink, and it's a very moderate amount on those days. Well, then let's say you have, and you're a Christian, you have a relation come over who's a former alcoholic, and they can't touch a drop. You know what I mean? And depending on how you handle the situation, you can sin against your brother. You can cause their hearts to be sort of emboldened. I mean, when I hear, let's say, people talk about good times they have drinking or using drugs, it makes my heart feel something. Because I remember good times drinking and using drugs. And so it makes my heart feel, I don't know about emboldened, but it makes it, I can feel, it tempts you. It tempts you. It tempts me anyways, right? It tempts one. Or it can. So when your conscience against something is weak, you think, I can't touch that stuff. You know, right? I can't, like if I say, I can't touch alcohol. So that's your truth. You can't touch it. And then, and you know, if you can have knowledge too and actually be like, well, I can't touch it, but I mean, I know I could, but I know I shouldn't. And that's a good way to, you know, it's a good place to be to understand what you should do versus what you could do. That's what I'm saying. It's like, yes, I can. I have the ability to take a small amount. It's lawful to me. All things are lawful to me. I can use that. But should I? You know, it's been a problem in the past. Maybe I shouldn't. You know, those are the way we should approach those questions. Same thing with the eating things sacrificed to idols. Should I do what I have liberty to do? Well, I could do it. Of course you could do it because you have liberty to do it. You could do it. But what if someone see you doing it? You know? Say like, well, I don't, you know, I have liberty to take a little alcohol. It's one thing when you do it at home. It's another thing when you go, well, I'll just take some at the bar. And I'll just have 1 beer. But they see you there and they say, look at, there's that Christian guy drinking that beer. Now you've emboldened them. I don't even know if he's talking about necessarily about Christians per se, but anyone whose conscience is weak. And it certainly complicates the preaching of the gospel to them. And certainly here he's definitely talking about a brother. And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? Through you being a know-it-all, full of liberty person, puffed up with your own sense of yourself, understand, you know, what you understand about the world and reality and everything that goes on in it, and God, you know so much about God. But you're bringing about the downfall of a brother potentially. It's not saying, what he's saying is, be careful. Don't bring brethren down for the sake of your liberty. You know what I mean? Your liberty does not commend you to God. The things you are permitted to do, like if you can smoke because you have liberty, it doesn't make you aren't like, oh well, God, this commends me to God. Now God is looking down and smiling at me. No. No, if you have liberty to do something, using it does not commend you to God. That is something that God has given us that for our benefit, but it doesn't make us rise in his eyes like, oh, look at, he really understands how things go. He's really got knowledge. I'm so impressed. For when you sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. When we wound the conscience of a brother through that kind of behavior where we just take our liberty and use it in a way that's careless, that's unmindful, we wound their consciences, if we do affect them in a negative way, we are sinning against Christ. And now our highfalutin knowledge that we think we have, we know so much. We've sinned against Christ. We haven't commended ourselves to God. We have sinned against Christ. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. If meat makes my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world stands. See, again, that's hypothetically. If he's just saying, if eating meat were to make, now, Paul sometimes draws these contrasts in which he goes overboard on one side of things. Because he does have something to say against people who are a little too, who their knowledge is, you shouldn't do that. And who are you to judge another man's liberty? That's where you need to grow up. And there is a degree to which it is like there's a subtle balance. We have to judge. We have to use good judgment. There are times which it makes sense and it is right for us because we don't want to wound our brother's conscience, right? But there are some people whose consciences we will not wound. We're not going to wound their conscience so much as we will offend them in some, offend is kind of the same thing. What is what I'm looking for? We will provoke their wrath. And this is something that's just ongoing in the church all the time. There are people who follow after the law and legal requirements and such. And to those people, for example, I've used this on many occasions that we talk about, like the Saturday Sabbath people. The Saturday Sabbath keeping people are very adamant about, like, that one, keeping church on Sunday is bad. And in fact, I'm not sure whether it's worse to not go to church at all or to go on Sunday. Because according to one of their prophets, that's supposed to be the mark of the beast, is worshiping God on Sunday. Now, I think that's absolutely off the rails, right? But to them, it's a big deal. So, I mean, I only bear with it to a certain point. Because it's one thing when a brother is weak, but another when they go off the rails and then they just begin trying to lord it over everyone with their legalism. They try to bring everyone into bondage. It's just like, let me use this as an example, because Paul while he says this is a very sweeping generalization here, I won't eat meat till, or while the world standeth, if it makes my brother to offend. Okay, let me ask you this question, Paul. And this is going to seem, whatever. You can't blaspheme Paul. He's our fellow brethren. He is a man like unto me. You know what I mean? I'm one of his disciples. And I'll pose this question to him. He can't answer, but for you to think about. Okay? Paul, if it make my brother to offend, shall I circumcise? This uncircumcised brother? It offends him that he is not circumcised. You know what I mean? So there is a point at which we say, okay, wait a second. This brother has conscience of things like circumcision. And he thinks he becomes offended if we don't circumcise these Gentiles. Because he's already talked about this. Meat commendeth us not to God. Circumcision commendeth us not to God, and neither does uncircumcision. He already said neither one commendeth us. He that eateth the meat does not commend himself to God, and neither does the one that eats not. When he thinks he does, and he becomes puffed up with that thought, which is not even knowledge because it's false, right? When he becomes puffed up with the thought that he is doing some great service to God by not eating anything sacrificed to an idol, when he believes that of himself, he's become puffed up. You know what I mean? He is at fault. There are a lot of ways in which brethren can sin against each other and become puffed up in their knowledge one way or the other. And so, when we approach delicate situations with people, there's a necessity of us being mindful of other people, but not so servile that we sacrifice our principles. You know what I mean? I know that an idol is nothing. I'm not going to knowingly cause my brother to stumble, but I'm also not going to be brought into bondage by someone else's false beliefs. Just because someone else thinks I got to be in church on Sunday doesn't mean, or Saturday or whatever, on a particular day that I have to be attendant to a lecture, which is essentially all that is. That's the thing, is like, you can go to church and not fellowship with anybody. Just go, listen to the pastor preach, and for most Sunday Sabbath keepers or Saturday Sabbath keepers, it doesn't matter. You've fulfilled your whole obligation. You don't have to talk to anyone else there. You don't have to do anything. You just got to be there. I figure that's the ground level of how you support the church financially, is you get people in there on Saturday, Sunday, whatever. You get them. You got to have people in the pews to have coins in the coffers. Okay. And so it's a necessity for them. I see why a lot of the establishment clergy would be adamant about keeping it, but the average person, it's not so obvious. Did I start that late? I still have 3 minutes left, or 2 minutes left in this study, and it's done. So let's just look at that verse one more time. If meat make my brother to offend, the word offend means scandalon. It means to be. We think of scandalize. The word literally means like a trap stick. Something that causes someone to be ensnared. To be caught somehow. Whether in a sin or in their own mental trap. You know what I mean? Like, because their conscience is, you cause them to fall into something. Yes, I will eat no meat while the world standeth, if I make my brother to offend. But will you suffer all men to be circumcised, lest it offend your brother? So what I'm saying is there is a line. If it's as simple as offending him with my meat, and I can avoid it, yes. which means, you may find yourself avoiding your brother and doing things in secret. I don't know. The ultimate thing is that we all come to a better knowledge. That's why we study the Bible. That's why I teach the Scriptures. If we could all come to a better knowledge of the Scriptures, perhaps we wouldn't have as much necessity of sneaking around each other, avoiding showing each other what we're eating, and and pretending to pay attention in church. Maybe we could avoid a lot of that. I don't know. So that concludes we concluded chapter 7, and we got through 8. I didn't want to start 9 because then because it's much better to start the chapter in the new study. And also, I didn't want chapter 8 to not appear in the description, blah, 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 blah. I don't need to explain that. All right. Anyways, we're done with today. Look forward to staying with you again tomorrow, continuing in 1 Corinthians.
Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I have kept thy word. Thou art good and doest good. Teach me thy statutes. The proud have forged a lie against me, but I will keep thy precepts with my whole heart. Their heart is as fat as grease, but I delight in thy law. It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. The law of thy mouth is better to me than thousands of